Hi, my friend. Welcome back. I hope wherever you are right now, the room around you feels a little softer than the day has been. Maybe you are listening late at night, maybe in the morning with a quiet cup of something warm, maybe while the world outside is still making too much noise, as it usually does, because apparently the world has never learned to whisper properly. If you enjoy these slow journeys through the strange corners of human history, you can gently like the video, subscribe, and if you feel like it, leave a little comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is there. I always like imagining these stories, moving through different rooms, different cities, different small hours of the night. And tonight, we are beginning with something so ordinary that most of us barely notice it anymore. A pair of glasses on a bedside table, a lens wiped with the edge of a shirt, a person reaching for their frames before they even fully open their eyes. Such a small ritual, almost nothing. And yet, for most of human history, if the world was blurry when you woke up, it simply stayed blurry. There was no neat little object waiting beside you, no folded arms of metal or plastic, no prescription, no optometrist asking you whether number 1 was clearer or number 2, while you sat there pretending to be confident, when honestly both looked like fog having an argument. There was only your body, your eyes, the light, and whatever mercy the day decided to give you. For a long, long time, bad eyesight was not a problem people solved. It was a condition they survived. And that is a very different thing, because before glasses, poor vision was not just about seeing badly. It changed how you worked, how you aged, how people judged you, how safe you felt after sunset, how close you stood to fire, how often you asked for help, how much pride you swallowed, and how many small humiliations gathered silently around your life. Imagine waking in a room where the morning has only just begun to press itself through a small window. Not bright modern morning, not the clean white flood of an electric bulb, but a thin grey light, cold at the edges, slipping through shutters, touching a clay floor, a wooden stool, a folded cloth, a cup, a wall darkened by smoke. You open your eyes, and the room is there, but not entirely. The shapes are familiar because you know them. You know where the stool is because you have struck your shin against it before. You know where the door is because your hand remembers it. You know where the hearth is because the smell of ash sits there, even when the fire is dead. But the world does not arrive sharply. It comes in patches. A pale square of light, a dark beam overhead, a blur where a person might be standing, a movement near the doorway that could be your child, your husband, your mother, your neighbour, or simply a coat hung badly in the wrong place. And for a moment, before the voice comes, before the footsteps tell you, before the body moves close enough to become a person, you wait inside uncertainty. That uncertainty is where our story lives. Today, if you cannot see clearly, you usually have language for it. Nearsighted, farsighted, astigmatism, presbyopia, cataracts, dry eyes, eye strain. You may complain. You may ignore it longer than you should. You may squint at your phone like a suspicious owl, but eventually you can name the problem. And naming a problem gives it a kind of fence. It becomes something located, something medical, something ordinary. But in the ancient and medieval world, for most people, poor eyesight was not always separated cleanly from personality, aging, morality, laziness, weakness, clumsiness, or fate. If you did not recognize someone on the road, you might be rude. If you made a mistake in your work, you might be careless. If you failed to see danger at dusk, you might be foolish. If you could not thread a needle, perhaps your hands were failing. If you could not read a line of holy text, perhaps your mind was tired. If you missed a face in the market, perhaps you were proud. People have always been very talented at blaming the person before blaming the condition. Humanity did not need glasses for that. We invented judgment quite early. So before eyewear, people did what humans always do when the body begins to fail quietly. They adjusted, they improvised, they pretended. They built habits around the weakness, and then forgot the weakness was there, because the habit had become part of life. A person who could not see well in the distance learned to wait until someone came closer. They listened for the walk, the cough, the rhythm of sandals, the sound of a tool belt, the shape of a voice before the shape of a face. A person who could not see close objects learned to hold things farther away, then farther still, until the arm became a measuring instrument of old age. The page went away from the eyes. The needle moved toward the window. The coin was tilted toward the doorway. The child was called over, not always with tenderness, sometimes with impatience, because dependence is easier to disguise as annoyance. Come here. Tell me what this says. Is that mark a 7 or a 1? Is the thread through? Is that him coming down the road? Is the sheep limping? Is there a stain on this cloth? Read that line again. No, not that line. The one below it. No, the one below that. And the young eyes answered. In a household before glasses, children were not just children. They were sometimes the sharpest optical instruments in the room. Small, noisy, distractible instruments, yes. Not always polished to the highest standard, but still useful. A child could see the tiny tear in fabric, the dropped needle in rushes, the colour change in grain, the face approaching from the road, the small letters on a scrap of writing. The old had memory, skill, authority, experience. The young had focus. And that must have created a strange little reversal inside daily life. The person who knew what everything meant could no longer see everything clearly, while the person who could see it clearly did not yet know what it meant. That is one of the quiet cruelties of poor vision. It does not always remove knowledge. It separates knowledge from detail. A weaver could know the pattern perfectly and still lose the thread. A merchant could understand numbers and still misread the mark. A monk could know the prayer by heart and still watch the letters blur into a dark river. A grandmother could know exactly how a garment should be mended, exactly where the seam should turn, exactly how the cloth should behave under the hand, and still be defeated by the eye of the needle, that tiny metal gatekeeper that has probably humiliated more human beings than many kings. And all of this happened inside a world where light itself was unreliable. Before glasses, light was the first technology of vision. Not lenses, not frames, light. Morning was useful. Noon was harsh, but generous. Late afternoon was a warning. Evening was the slow theft of detail. Night was not simply darkness. It was the moment when weak eyes became weaker, and even strong eyes had to negotiate with flame. We sometimes imagine candlelight as romantic because we are deeply spoiled creatures with backup electricity. We see a candle now and think of calm, intimacy, maybe a bath, maybe a dinner, where people pretend not to check their phones. But for someone who had to work by weak flame, candlelight was not romance. It was an unstable little sun with a bad attitude. It flickered. It smoked. It leaned when the air moved. It made shadows tremble. It brightened one part of a surface and abandoned another. It created glare on polished things and darkness beside them. It made the eyes water. It made a room feel alive in ways that were not always comforting. A lamp could help, but it could also stink. Oil had its smell. Wicks needed care. Smoke gathered above. Firelight moved constantly. The room breathed with it. A face near the hearth might appear, disappear, sharpen, soften, become old, become strange, all in the space of a few seconds. If your sight was already poor, the fire did not simply illuminate the world. It rearranged it. Now, place an aging person there. Maybe a scribe. Maybe a woman sewing. Maybe a craftsman repairing a small metal clasp. Maybe a healer sorting herbs. The air is cold away from the fire and smoky near it, because history enjoys offering solutions that create new problems. The fingers are stiff, the back aches, the eyes burn. The work is close, small, fussy. It demands attention, it punishes mistakes, and the light keeps moving. So the body begins its little negotiations. Lean closer. No, too close. Move back. Turn the object. Raise it. Lower it. Move nearer the window. The window is cold. Go back to the fire. The fire smokes. Rub the eyes. Blink. Pretend nothing is wrong. Try again. This is important because before glasses, the first answer to bad eyesight was often not invention. It was posture. The human spine became an optical device. The neck bent, the head tilted, one eye closed, the shoulders curved, the page moved, the hand searched. The whole body tried to solve what the lens had not yet been asked to solve, and over time these compensations became so ordinary that no one thought of them as technology, but they were. A woman holding cloth to the window was using architecture as eyewear. A monk waiting for morning was using the sun as a reading aid. A merchant asking a younger clerk to check a figure was using another human being as a corrective lens. A shepherd, listening for bells because he could not count animals in the dusk, was using sound to replace sight. Humans are very good at this. We lose one certainty and recruit another sense. Touch learns the room. Hearing learns distance. Smell marks the hearth, the animals, the rain coming, the mold in grain. Memory fills in the missing outlines. Routine becomes a map laid over the blur. But routine has a dark side. It works beautifully until something moves. A stool in the wrong place. A child asleep where no child usually sleeps. A tool not returned to its hook. A stone on the path. A stranger standing where the neighbour usually stands. A door left half open. A step missed in the dark. Poor vision turns change into danger. This is why the blurry world was not only inconvenient, it was quietly unsafe. At night, especially, uncertainty deepened. The edges of things disappeared first. Then depth became treacherous. Then movement became more important than shape. A person with weak vision might not know what they were seeing until it made a sound. Something beyond the firelight might be a hanging cloth, or a man, or a branch scraping the wall. Something at the edge of the road might be a dog, a bush, a crouching person, or nothing at all. It is easy to be brave in daylight. It is harder when the world refuses to finish drawing itself. And fear, when mixed with bad vision, has a way of becoming creative. A shadow becomes a body becomes a threat, a sound becomes intention, a half-seen face becomes memory, rumor, superstition. This does not mean people were foolish. It means their information was incomplete. And incomplete information is one of the oldest ingredients in human fear. Think of a nearsighted person on a road before spectacles. Up close, perhaps they function beautifully. Their hands are skilled. They can carve, sew, read, grind, grain, sort seeds, notice tiny flaws in metal or cloth. The near world belongs to them. But the distance is not loyal. A figure approaching along the road is only a smear of colour and motion. Is it a friend? A tax collector? A thief? A soldier? Someone angry? Someone carrying news? Someone carrying a blade? You cannot tell yet. You must wait. Waiting is not passive when your body is preparing for several possible futures. And while you wait, other people may misunderstand you. They wave. You do not wave back. Not because you are arrogant, but because they are still a blur. They greet you from across a yard. You hesitate. They think you are cold. You pass someone important without the proper sign of respect because you did not recognize the clothing or face in time. Now, your eyes have created a social problem. This is the strange thing about vision. It feels private, but its failures become public very quickly. Poor eyesight can make a person seem rude before it makes them seem disabled. For the farsighted, or for those aging into presbyopia, the cruelty arrived from the opposite direction. The far world might remain decent enough. The road, the sky, the doorway, the person entering the room all still visible. But the near world began to withdraw. And the near world is where so much human life actually happens. Food, thread, ink, skin, wood grain, coin marks, letter forms, splinters, seeds, seals, knots, herbs, wounds, tools, the face of a sleeping child, the tiny crack in a bowl before it becomes a broken bowl, the difference between a useful thing and a spoiled thing. At first, the change might be subtle. A page seems dimmer than it did before. A needle becomes annoying. Fine work takes longer. The person blames the light because blaming the light is one of the oldest and most respectable forms of denial. The candle is bad. The ink is bad. The apprentice cut the quill badly. The cloth is rough. The weather is wrong. The room is smoky. The morning is dull. The world, in short, has become incompetent. Then the arms begin to stretch. There is something almost tender and ridiculous about presbyopia because it turns the human arm into a desperate optical instrument. The page moves away from the face, then a little farther, then farther still. A person who once bent over words now holds them at a distance, as if the text has become socially unpleasant. Eventually, the arm reaches its limit. The page cannot be sent any farther away unless one is willing to involve furniture, which, to be fair, humans probably tried at some point. And when even distance fails, the truth appears. Not sharply, of course. But it appears. The eyes are changing. For someone whose identity did not depend on clothes work, this was frustrating. For someone whose life did depend on close work, it was terrifying. A scribe losing near vision was not simply aging, he was losing his profession line by line. A monk who could no longer read sacred text did not merely need help, he was being separated from the daily rhythm of devotion. A merchant misreading accounts risked money, reputation, accusation, fraud. A seamstress losing fine vision could still know every technique and yet be betrayed by the smallest opening in a needle. A jeweler could still understand beauty and ruin it with one wrong cut. A healer might know the herb but misread the wound. A scholar might still have a mind full of language, argument, memory, and scripture, while the page beneath him turned into a field of insects. This is where eyewear becomes more than an invention. It becomes a rescue mission for aging intelligence. But before that rescue arrived, people lived inside compromise. They made letters larger when they could. They asked others to read. They memorized more. They relied on oral repetition. They moved work into daylight. They gave fine tasks to younger hands. They accepted that certain skills belonged to certain ages, not because the mind had emptied, but because the eye had dimmed. And this made aging visible in small, humiliating ways. Not dramatic ways, not always blindness, not tragedy announced by trumpets, just a pause before answering. A coin held too long, a page moved too far away, a thread missed again, a face not recognized, a mistake in a ledger, a child called over one more time, a sigh, a joke made before someone else could make it. "My eyes are not what they were," said lightly. Because if you say a painful thing lightly enough, people may not notice that it hurts. The ancient world and medieval world had explanations for vision, some practical, some medical, some wrong, some not entirely wrong, some wrapped in theories of humours, spirits, vapours, aging, divine will, bodily balance, and environmental influence. People used washes, salves, rest, diet, prayer, charms, and surgical procedures that could be brave, desperate, or horrifying, depending on the case. But for ordinary refractive errors, the simple fact remained. The eye did not focus properly, and the world did not adjust itself out of kindness. So humans adjusted the world themselves. One of the earliest and simplest tricks was magnification through curved transparent material. Water could enlarge, glass could distort, polished crystal could bend light. People noticed these things long before wearable glasses existed. A drop of water on a surface can make details swell. A rounded glass vessel filled with liquid can change the apparent size of what lies behind it. A clear stone placed over text can make letters seem larger. These are not eyeglasses yet. They are hints. Little accidents that whisper, perhaps vision is not fixed. Perhaps the eye can be helped from outside the body. That whisper mattered. Because for a long time, optical help was not something you wore. It was something you approached. You brought the object to the light. You brought the eye to the object. You brought the page beneath the stone. You moved your body into position around the aid. The aid did not belong to you like glasses do now. It sat there, awkward and precious, and you arranged yourself around it. The reading stone is one of the most beautiful and annoying objects in this story. Imagine a smooth, convex piece of glass or crystal resting directly on a manuscript page. Beneath it, a few words swell and clarify. Around it, the rest of the page remains ordinary, dim, and waiting. You do not read freely. You travel, slowly, word by word. The hand moves the stone. The eye follows. The page becomes landscape, and the reader crawls across it under a little dome of magnified light. It must have felt miraculous the first time, and then, 5 minutes later, irritating. This is very human. We discover a miracle and almost immediately wish it were more convenient. A reading stone could not help you recognize someone across a courtyard. It could not help you walk safely at dusk. It could not make a weak candle steady. It could not correct every kind of poor vision. It helped mostly with close work, especially reading, and even then only in a limited way. But it introduced a permanent idea. The failing eye could be assisted, not cured, perhaps. Not restored by prayer alone, not explained away, not simply endured, assisted. That idea moved slowly through hands, workshops, monasteries, markets, and minds. And somewhere in that slow movement, in late medieval Europe, especially in the glassmaking and craft world of Italy, the solution changed shape. The magnifier rose from the page and came toward the face. This was the strange leap. Not merely to enlarge text, but to place shaped glass before the eyes. Not one stone dragged over words, but 2 lenses held in front of the body's own windows. A tool, no longer lying on the page, but sitting at the boundary between the person and the world. The first true eyeglasses seem to have appeared in Italy in the late 13th century, probably around the 1280s or 1290s. The exact inventor is lost, which feels almost unfair. Someone, or several someones, helped give aging readers their near world back, and history did not even keep their name properly. There is a famous story about a man named Salvino d'Amati, but that tidy inventor tale is not reliable. History loves a clean hero. Reality, being less cooperative, gives us craftsmen, experiments, sermons, rumours, workshops, and anonymous hands. And perhaps that is more fitting. Because glasses were not born from one shining moment where someone shouted, "I have fixed vision!" while everyone applauded politely in Latin. More likely, they emerged from need pressing against craft. Old readers needed help. Glassworkers knew how to shape material. Scholars and monks needed text. Merchants needed accounts. Cities needed clerks. The written world was expanding, and human eyes were still aging at the same old speed, which was inconsiderate of them. The earliest spectacles were probably convex lenses, useful for presbyopia and farsightedness, the conditions that made near work difficult. They were not modern prescription glasses. They were not light, flexible, perfectly fitted things. They may have been held before the eyes, balanced, riveted, pinched, or supported in awkward ways. They might slip. They might pinch the nose. They might distort the edges of the page. They might glare in candlelight. They might break. They might be expensive. They might make the wearer look strange. But then the page sharpened. And that must have been extraordinary. Imagine an older reader who has slowly been losing words. Not all at once. That would almost be easier to understand. But gradually, cruelly. The letters have become small, dark knots. The margins have become safer than the text. Reading has become effort. Effort has become avoidance. Avoidance has become sadness. The person still loves the book, still knows the motions, still sits near the light, still wants the words, but the words no longer come willingly. Then, someone places 2 crude lenses before the eyes. The page changes. Not perfectly. Not magically in the modern cinematic sense, but enough. Enough for letters to separate. Enough for ink to become language again. Enough for the old mind to feel the door open. There must have been laughter. There must have been tears. There must also have been suspicion, because humans rarely receive a new technology without immediately wondering whether it is improper, ridiculous, dangerous, vain, expensive, or somehow the fault of young people. A tool on the face is intimate. It changes appearance. It announces need. It says, "My eyes are weak," at the very same moment that it makes the person stronger. That contradiction never left glasses. Even now, glasses can make someone look intelligent, tired, stylish, fragile, severe, gentle, old, young, fashionable, invisible, powerful, bookish, nervous, or beautiful, depending on the frame and the face and the observer's prejudices. From the beginning, they did two opposite things at once. They corrected vision and displayed imperfection. They hid weakness by revealing it. For medieval people, that must have been a social adjustment as much as a practical one. Imagine seeing someone wearing lenses for the first time. Two glass circles before the eyes. A little frame. A strange shine. The gaze altered. The person looking through something. Were they wise? Were they frail? Were they pretending to be learned? Were they using a trick? Was this a scholarly tool, a luxury, a medical aid, a vanity, a miracle, or just another annoying object that would be misplaced at the worst possible moment? Because the invention of glasses also invented the problem of losing your glasses. This is important for historical continuity. The moment humans created eyewear, someone probably placed it somewhere very sensible and then forgot where that was. This may not be in the official records, but spiritually, we know it is true. Still, even awkward glasses changed the terms of aging. They returned close labour to people who had begun to lose it. They extended the working life of readers, scribes, scholars, merchants, and artisans. They allowed older eyes to remain useful in a world increasingly dependent on marks, texts, contracts, accounts, prayers, recipes, measurements, and records. They did not solve all blindness. They did not cure cataracts. They did not help everyone. They were not immediately available to all classes. They did not eliminate bad light, smoke, poverty, infection, injury, or age. But they did something immense. They gave people usable years. That may be the deepest truth of eyewear. Glasses do not merely make the world sharper, they give time back. They delay the moment when a person must stop reading, stop sewing, stop checking, stop carving, stop copying, stop working, stop recognizing the fine details by which life is held together. They postpone dependence. They soften embarrassment. They return authority to the aging hand. They make the old eye less lonely. And before them, people lived in a world where that rescue did not yet exist. So tonight, as we move deeper into this story, we are not only asking when humans invented eyewear. That question is too small on its own. The better question is what happened to all the people who needed glasses before glasses had arrived. The woman by the hearth, the monk in winter, the shepherd at dusk, the merchant with the coin. The child called again and again to read what adults could not see, the patient with clouded eyes who still recognized voices long after faces had faded, the old scholar holding a page farther away, as if distance itself might become mercy. They were not waiting for an invention, because they did not know it was coming. They were simply living inside the blur. And that blur had rules. It taught patience and dependence and suspicion. It made daylight precious. It made windows important. It made children useful in ways they probably found annoying. It made night larger. It made aging more visible. It made close work cruel. It made far movement uncertain. It made the world feel slightly unfinished, as though reality itself had been painted in a hurry and left to dry in smoke. And then, slowly, quietly, through glass, craft, accident, and need, humans began to sharpen the unfinished world. The strange thing about the blurry world is that people rarely stopped to describe it directly. Human beings usually do not write long emotional confessions about conditions everyone around them shares. If half the village squints at dusk, nobody thinks to document the squinting. It becomes part of the weather of life. Ordinary, invisible, like smoke in the ceiling beams or cold feet in winter, or the fact that breadcrumbs somehow appear in every crack of every table no matter how carefully one lives. And yet the signs are everywhere once you begin looking for them. You see them in the architecture of old rooms, where windows became precious islands of survival. Not decoration, not aesthetic, survival. The best seat in a room was often the seat nearest the light, especially for older eyes. You see them in manuscript workshops, where work clustered around daylight. You see them in the complaints of scribes with tired eyes and stiff backs. You see them in older people slowly drifting away from close labor and toward instruction, memory, supervision, storytelling. You see them in the quiet migration of human bodies toward brightness. A person with weakening vision becomes deeply aware of where light lives. Modern people often treat light as background. We enter a room and touch a switch without even looking. Light obeys us now, or pretends to. Ancient light did not obey. It had moods. Morning light was different from winter light. Snow light was different from rain light. Firelight changed with the wood. Oil light depended on fuel quality. A cloudy afternoon could quietly ruin a day's delicate work. Imagine an old woman sorting lentils or grain on a dark table near evening. Her fingers still know the work. The movement itself is ancient in her hands. Separate the good from the bad, stones from grain, rot from health. Tiny distinctions, tiny judgments, tiny repetitions. Human civilization depends on millions of tiny distinctions made correctly. That is one of the less glamorous truths of history. Now, the light weakens. The shadows lengthen across the table. The pale grain and the pale stones begin to resemble one another. Her eyes ache slightly. Not dramatic pain, just that slow pressure behind the eyes that says, enough. She leans closer. Her neck tightens. Her fingers hesitate more often. A mistake enters the pile, then another. Soon she is no longer sorting confidently. She is guessing. And guessing is dangerous in a world without modern safety nets. One spoiled grain sack could matter. One wrong herb could matter. One badly sewn seam could matter. One miscounted animal could matter. One wrongly identified person on the road could matter. The blurry world punished certainty, very slowly, and then all at once. So people adapted in ways so gradual they barely noticed it happening. They moved their chairs nearer windows. They arranged work tables beneath openings in walls. They delayed difficult tasks until morning. They trusted younger eyes for inspection. They developed habits that seemed cultural or personal but were often deeply physical responses to weak vision. This is one of the most interesting things about human beings. We turn survival strategies into traditions with astonishing speed. A person begins sitting in a particular place because the light helps them see. 10 years later, it is simply their seat. Another person always reads near the doorway because daylight lasts longest there. Soon, everyone accepts that this is where reading happens. A grandmother insists that mending should be done in the morning, not because of spiritual philosophy, but because by dusk, the thread becomes impossible. A monk develops a ritual of cleaning his reading stone before prayer. A merchant angles coins towards sunlight before accepting them. A shepherd listens for bells instead of relying fully on sight. The adaptation survives long after the reason becomes invisible, and sometimes the adaptation becomes permanent enough that later generations think it was intentional from the beginning. Human history is full of temporary solutions that quietly hardened into culture. Before glasses, posture itself became one of these cultures. The bent neck, the forward lean, the squint, the habit of bringing objects toward the face or away from it. Entire generations aged into the same physical choreography. Imagine a room full of older people before modern eyewear, heads tilted toward light, pages held at careful angles, threads brought near lips, hands extended awkwardly, faces tense with concentration. It must have looked almost ceremonial. There is something deeply intimate about watching another human being try to see. Perhaps because seeing feels so private to us, we assume everyone inhabits the same visual world until suddenly they do not. One person sees the bird immediately, another sees only branches. One recognizes a face from across the street, another waits until the voice arrives. One notices the stain on cloth, another notices nothing until the cloth is ruined. And before eyewear, there was no clean dividing line between normal vision and impaired vision. There was only a wide range of bodies coping with a difficult visual environment as best they could. The environment itself was brutal for the eyes. Smoke alone deserves its own chapter in human history. Nearly every indoor fire-filled civilization spent centuries quietly irritating its own eyes. Hearth smoke, oil smoke, workshop smoke, forge smoke, candle soot, cooking smoke, eyes watered constantly in many indoor environments. The richer the shadows looked in paintings centuries later, the more miserable the actual room probably smelled. And smoke does something unpleasant to uncertainty. It softens edges further. It blurs flame. It turns distance muddy. It creates halos around light sources. A room filled with weak illumination and suspended smoke particles is practically designed to torment aging eyes. Now imagine trying to copy a manuscript there. A medieval scribe's life sounds peaceful when summarized quickly. Ink, silence, candlelight, beautiful letters, calm, devotion. Very poetic, very marketable on modern coffee mugs. The reality was less elegant. Hours bent over parchment, fingers stained, eyes burning, tiny letters demanding precision, repeated mistakes scraped away with knives, winter cold stiffening the hand, summer insects landing on pages, poor light, smoke, fatigue. The endless repetition of symbols that must remain exact because a single error could alter meaning, doctrine, law, medicine, prayer. And over time, the eyes rebelled. There are surviving complaints from scribes about physical exhaustion, cold, and strain. Not dramatic literary monologues, unfortunately. Human history would be easier if medieval monks had kept detailed emotional journals titled, "My eyes are betraying me again." But enough survives to understand the labor involved. Aging scribes must have feared the slow retreat of clarity more than almost anything else, because the terrifying thing about vision loss is not only blindness, it is inconsistency. Some mornings are better than others. Some light helps. Some pages cooperate. Some do not. You think perhaps the problem has passed, and then dusk arrives and the letters dissolve again. You blame the lamp, then the parchment, then fatigue, then weather, then, eventually, reluctantly, yourself, and all the while, the younger scribes beside you read effortlessly. There is a particular kind of loneliness in watching another person perform easily what has become difficult for you. The same thing happened in countless trades. A seamstress missing the eye of a needle again and again, while a younger apprentice succeeds instantly. A jeweler struggling with tiny engravings. A carpenter squinting at measurements. A healer lifting a wound toward the light. A cook bringing herbs close to the face. A fisherman scanning grey water at dawn for movement he once saw immediately. Before glasses, aging often arrived first through detail, not through weakness of legs, not through dramatic illness, through detail. The world remained visible enough to continue living in it, but small things began escaping, and small things are what daily life is made of. It is strange to think how much of human survival depends on noticing tiny differences. The wrong berry, the slight crack in wood, the subtle limp in an animal, the discoloration in food, the difference between one herb and another, the nearly invisible movement in grass before a snake strikes. Tiny signs everywhere. Civilization often imagines itself built by grand ideas, but most human beings survived by noticing small things correctly for a very long time. Poor eyesight interfered with this relationship between humans and detail. And so people compensated with ritualized certainty. Objects remained in fixed places. Rooms stayed arranged carefully. Tools hung from the same hooks. Furniture moved rarely. Paths became memorized. People counted steps in darkness. Hands learned walls. Feet learned floorboards. Families learned each other's movements. The body became partly independent from sight. This is why unexpected change felt especially threatening in dim environments. A stool moved unexpectedly could become injury. A misplaced knife could become disaster. A child asleep in the wrong corner of a room could become terror in the dark. Poor vision rewards predictability and punishes surprise, which may partly explain why many traditional societies valued routine so intensely. Routine is comforting psychologically, yes, but it is also visually efficient. If everything remains where it was yesterday, weak eyes can still function. At night, this dependence deepened. Modern darkness is rarely true darkness. There is always some glow now. A streetlight through curtains, a digital clock, a hallway light, the tiny accusing stare of electronics that never fully sleep. Ancient darkness was heavier than ours, and for people with poor eyesight, it arrived early, not necessarily at sunset, earlier than that, the moment the light dropped below what their eyes could negotiate. One person in a household might continue working comfortably, while another's useful world had already begun collapsing into shadow. Imagine the emotional effect of that. Others still functioning normally, while your own reality shrinks first. So people withdrew from detailed tasks earlier. They sat closer to flame. They listened more carefully. They avoided unnecessary movement. They became cautious. And caution itself could become socially visible. A hesitant step in darkness. A pause before greeting someone. A hand testing a surface. A reluctance to travel after dusk. Poor eyesight could make a person seem timid even when they were merely adapting intelligently to limited information. There is another uncomfortable truth here. Before eyewear, weak eyesight could quietly reduce independence long before complete blindness. That dependence could be humiliating, especially for older men accustomed to authority or skilled workers whose identities depended on competence. Asking for help repeatedly changes the emotional texture of a life. Read this for me. Look at this. Tell me who that is. Is this done correctly? Is this enough light? Is this the right road? The request itself is small, but repeated thousands of times, it reshapes dignity. Some people probably became irritable, not because age changed their personality, but because uncertainty exhausted them. And uncertainty is exhausting, especially visual uncertainty. Humans like knowing what they are looking at. When the world stops resolving clearly, the brain works harder. It fills gaps. It guesses. It interprets shadows. It leans heavily on expectation. Sometimes correctly, sometimes not. This is where superstition, fear, and poor visibility begin quietly cooperating. A half-seen figure becomes threatening more easily than a clear one. Strange lights become suspicious. Shapes in darkness acquire intention. In forests, roads, monasteries, ships, villages, and isolated farms, uncertainty itself became part of the emotional atmosphere of life. Not because people were irrational, but because their visual information was incomplete. A person with poor night vision or severe myopia walking through a medieval village after sunset might genuinely inhabit a more frightening reality than someone with stronger eyesight. Every movement beyond the torchlight carried ambiguity. Every distant shape remained unresolved too long. The imagination had more time to enter the picture, and imagination loves empty space. It fills silence quickly. It fills darkness even faster. There is probably a reason ghost stories thrive in dim environments and rarely begin with, "Everything was brightly illuminated and visually verified." Meanwhile, in wealthier households and educated circles, another problem was growing quietly larger. Books. Books became more important. Reading became more important. Administration expanded. Trade expanded. Religious reading expanded. Records multiplied. Contracts mattered. Literacy spread unevenly, but steadily. More and more parts of society depended on close visual work, and human eyes, stubbornly ancient things that they are, continued aging exactly as before. This tension created pressure for better light, better glass, better magnification, better methods, better tools. Human civilization was becoming increasingly textual, while the human body remained biologically medieval, which is honestly still true today whenever someone in their 30s makes a strange noise standing up from a chair. At first, the solutions remained awkward. Reading stones became useful among readers and scholars. Pieces of convex glass enlarged portions of text. Helpful, yes. Elegant, not entirely. One imagines the frustration of reading line by line beneath a little bubble of clarity, while the rest of the page waits outside focus like a patient crowd. Still, The experience must have been astonishing for people whose near vision had faded. To recover words, to watch letters return, to realize the eye could be helped from outside the body. That idea changed everything. But it also created new dependency, because once clarity returns, losing it again becomes harder to endure. A person who has lived their whole life in blur adapts differently from a person who briefly regains sharpness and then loses it. The second loss hurts more. This is another pattern humans repeat endlessly. We tolerate deprivation better than reversal. The first spectacles emerging in Italy during the late 13th century entered exactly this emotional landscape. A world hungry for visual assistance. A world increasingly dependent on reading. A world filled with aging clerks, scholars, monks, merchants, and craftsmen trying to remain useful. The early glasses themselves were awkward little miracles. Not modern miracles, medieval miracles. Which means useful, but inconvenient. Frames without sidearms. Lenses that helped some tasks, but not others. Objects that slipped, pinched, reflected firelight, distorted edges, and probably broke at the worst possible times. Yet despite all this, they spread. Because once humans discover a way to recover lost function, inconvenience becomes negotiable. The first moment an aging reader looked through corrective lenses and saw a page sharpen must have felt almost supernatural. Not because the lenses were perfect, but because the decline had seemed inevitable. And inevitability is powerful until someone interrupts it. That interruption matters emotionally. The old reader who expected only worsening blur suddenly experiences reversal. Not youth restored exactly, but possibility restored. The page returns. The thread returns. The account book returns. The prayer returns. The self returns a little. And perhaps, most importantly of all, the future changes shape. Because before eyewear, aging often carried an invisible countdown. Not toward death necessarily, toward unusability, the moment when your work became slower, then unreliable, then impossible. Glasses delayed that moment. They gave years back to people whose minds remained sharp while their eyes betrayed them. And that changed civilization more quietly than wars do, but perhaps more permanently than many kings ever managed. There is something oddly emotional about the first time a human being realizes the world does not have to remain exactly as the eye presents it. Not emotionally, in the grand cinematic sense. No orchestra. No dramatic revelation under lightning. Human discoveries are usually quieter than that, more awkward, more accidental. Someone notices something strange. A reflection, a distortion, a curve in water, a piece of polished crystal enlarging a line beneath it, a droplet making an insect appear larger, a bowl changing the shape of what lies behind it. And for a long time, these little optical oddities belonged more to curiosity than rescue. People noticed strange visual effects long before they understood them properly. Water changed appearances. Glass distorted shapes. Certain polished stones seemed to enlarge details or alter light. Bright sunlight bouncing off surfaces could hurt the eyes. Coloured materials could soften glare. The world itself was full of accidental experiments. The ancient world was not blind to optics. It was simply not yet equipped to industrialize help. That distinction matters. Humans often discover principles centuries before ordinary people benefit from them. Knowledge appears first as curiosity, luxury, philosophy, or entertainment. Only later does it descend into daily life, where tired people actually need it. And tired people needed help very badly, especially older readers. It is impossible to overstate how important reading became in certain parts of medieval society. Monasteries, courts, trade centres, schools, administrative offices, religious institutions. These worlds depended increasingly on written words. Not everybody could read, of course. Literacy spread unevenly and unfairly. But wherever reading became valuable, eyesight became valuable in a new way. Aging eyes became economic problems. That sounds cold, but it is true. An old farmer with weak near vision could still perform many forms of labour. Slower, perhaps, less comfortably, but possible. An aging scholar who could no longer read tiny script faced something different. The collapse of function could arrive suddenly and specifically. The mind remained capable, the memory remained full, the authority remained socially recognized. But the page itself became hostile. Imagine being trapped outside your own knowledge by your eyes. That is one of the great hidden emotional realities behind the invention of eyewear. And so, people experimented. Not always scientifically in the modern sense, more experimentally in the ancient human sense. Try this. Hold this differently. Polish this more. Add water. Use thinner glass. Curve it further. Bring it closer. Bring it farther away. Tilt toward light. Tilt away from glare. Entire generations of craftsmen worked in this half-world between observation and understanding. Glass itself was already a strange material to ancient and medieval people. Transparent, solid matter has something slightly magical about it even now. It behaves unlike stone, unlike wood, unlike metal. It allows vision through itself while still existing physically. It catches light, distorts it, reflects it, breaks it, traps it. And because glass behaved strangely, people kept discovering useful accidents. One of the most important of these accidents became the reading stone. The reading stone feels almost symbolic now. A little convex dome of glass sitting directly atop text. Primitive, clumsy, yet deeply important. It was not eyewear yet, but it pointed toward the idea that vision itself could be manipulated externally. Aging readers must have loved and hated these objects simultaneously. Loved them because they worked. Hated them because they worked incompletely. That combination is the birthplace of most technology. The reading stone enlarged only a small area at a time. You could not glide naturally across a page. You crawled through text beneath a moving island of clarity. Hand, eye, page, light, all had to cooperate. The larger world remained blurred while one tiny patch sharpened. But even this partial rescue changed things emotionally. Because before magnification, fading eyesight felt like pure loss. After magnification, loss became negotiable. The distinction between those two experiences is enormous. When humans believe decline is absolute, they adapt psychologically one way. When decline becomes adjustable, hope enters the picture. Hope is useful. Hope is also annoying. Once improvement becomes possible, dissatisfaction grows quickly. A monk who once accepted failing sight as fate might now wonder whether better glass existed somewhere else. A scholar might seek brighter light. A merchant might pay for clearer lenses. Expectations rise almost immediately after the first success. Humans become dissatisfied at astonishing speed. The first person who saw enlarged text beneath polished glass probably experienced wonder. The second person probably asked whether it could be lighter, and the third probably misplaced it. Meanwhile, the broader visual environment remained deeply uncomfortable, especially at night. Night before modern lighting deserves repeated attention because it shaped emotional life far more than we usually acknowledge. Darkness in the ancient and medieval world was not merely the absence of sunlight. It was an active condition, a territorial expansion of uncertainty. And uncertainty behaves differently when your eyesight is weak. A person with poor vision after sunset entered a layered world of partial information. Sounds arrived before shapes. Firelight moved unpredictably. Shadows stretched and contracted. Faces changed with flame movement. Familiar paths became uncertain. The imagination had room to operate. This matters because humans rarely separate physical uncertainty from emotional uncertainty. A half-seen object becomes psychologically heavier than a clearly seen one. Consider a near-sighted traveler entering a village at dusk. The road is muddy. The air smells faintly of smoke and damp earth. Somewhere, nearby, an animal shifts in straw. Torchlight flickers against walls. Figures move in patches of illumination and vanish again. Someone coughs. A door closes. A dog barks. Shapes exist briefly and then dissolve. The traveler cannot identify faces until they are very near. Every interaction arrives late. Recognition happens at the last moment. That delay changes social life. People with weak distance vision probably learned to rely heavily on voice, posture, clothing shape, movement patterns, even silhouettes. Humans become astonishingly observant when forced to compensate. A person may fail to recognize a face yet identify a friend instantly from the rhythm of footsteps alone. Bodies adapt, but adaptation is tiring. That exhaustion accumulates quietly over years. Constant interpretation, constant compensation, constant guessing. The brain works harder inside uncertainty, and sometimes uncertainty becomes fear. A figure outside the house at night, a movement in trees, something standing near the road, something watching from beyond the firelight. Weak vision gives fear more time to develop before reality resolves. This may partly explain why folklore and darkness became so deeply connected historically. Not simply because people were superstitious, but because many genuinely inhabited, visually uncertain environments. One can only stare into unresolved shadows for so many centuries before inventing ghosts. Even indoors, poor eyesight changed emotional texture. Imagine an aging woman sewing near the hearth long after sunset because daytime hours were consumed by other labor. The fire crackles softly. Smoke clings to the ceiling beams. The room smells of wool, ash, and cooked onions. Children sleep nearby. Her fingers are rough from work. She lifts thread toward her face again. Misses the needle. Tries again. Misses again. At first, she blames the light, then the needle, then perhaps quietly, privately, she blames herself. There is a sadness in repetitive failure at familiar tasks, especially tasks once performed effortlessly. And before glasses, millions of people experienced exactly this slow betrayal through ordinary detail. The thread, the coin, the grain, the splinter, the text, the wound, the face, Civilization depends on details remaining visible, which is why the invention of practical lenses mattered so profoundly once it arrived. But before we fully reach that moment, we need to drift for a while through another important part of this story: the long human attempt to understand what vision actually was. Because for centuries, humans argued about seeing in ways that now sound almost dreamlike. Did the eyes send something outward toward objects? Did objects send something inward? Was vision connected to spiritual force, internal fire, invisible rays, bodily balance? People observed vision constantly while understanding it imperfectly, which, honestly, remains one of humanity's favorite hobbies in many fields. Into this uncertain world came thinkers who approached optics more systematically. One of the most important was Ibn al-Haytham, known in the Latinized world as Al-Hazen. Living in the Islamic world around the 10th and 11th centuries, he studied light, vision, reflection, and perception in ways that profoundly influenced later understanding of optics. And there is something beautiful about this part of the story because it reveals how long the road is between understanding a principle and changing ordinary life. Knowledge moves slowly through civilization. A scholar writes, another copies, another translates, another misunderstands slightly, another improves the idea. A craftsman hears rumors of it indirectly generations later. A lens grinder experiments. A merchant funds production. A monastery buys tools. An old reader finally benefits. Centuries can separate the idea from the relief. That delay is deeply human. The world often contains solutions before ordinary people can access them. And while scholars debated optics, ordinary people continued squinting at dusk. That contrast should linger in the narration because it captures something eternal about civilization. Great intellectual achievements often coexist beside widespread daily discomfort. Humans could calculate astronomy while old scribes still strained over blurred manuscripts. Cathedrals rose toward heaven while aging artisans held work closer and closer to weakening eyes. Philosophers analyzed light, while ordinary women sorted grain beside smoky fires. Progress is rarely evenly distributed. Still, ideas matter. Understanding that light enters the eye rather than being emitted from it helped build a more accurate foundation for optics. Over generations, this knowledge mixed with practical craftsmanship, especially in places where glassworking became highly developed, and eventually, in northern Italy during the late 13th century, conditions aligned: trade, urban craft specialization, glassmaking skill, increasing literacy, religious reading, commercial records, administrative bureaucracy, aging readers desperate for help. The pressure became too great. Somewhere, among workshops and craftsmen, lenses stopped being merely objects held over text and became wearable aids. The earliest spectacles were probably strange-looking things, riveted frames balancing awkwardly before the eyes. No comfortable sidearms yet. No sleek, modern precision. Just two lenses mounted together in a way that allowed hands-free assistance. Hands-free, that detail alone mattered enormously. A reader could hold a page normally again. A scribe could work continuously. A merchant could inspect accounts without juggling magnifiers. A scholar could return both hands to the text. Small mechanical changes create enormous emotional consequences. And the emotional consequence here was relief. Not perfect relief, not universal relief, Not permanent relief, but relief. Imagine an aging monk trying spectacles for the first time. He sits near the best light available. The room smells faintly of old parchment, dust, wax, damp wool. Winter presses cold against stone walls. Someone hands him the device carefully, because fragile things become emotionally important very quickly. Perhaps he is skeptical, perhaps hopeful, perhaps embarrassed. He places the lenses before his eyes. The manuscript sharpens. Not magically, not like modern cinema, where the world suddenly bursts into impossible clarity. Medieval lenses had limitations, but enough detail returns, enough distinction, enough focus. The letters separate from one another again. And what must that have felt like emotionally? Not merely convenience, recovery. Imagine believing part of your useful life has ended, only to discover it can continue. That moment changes a person internally. It changes their relationship with aging itself. Before glasses, the future often narrowed, visually, year by year. After glasses, decline became negotiable, not defeated, negotiated. And humans love negotiation with mortality. Of course, spectacles also introduced entirely new absurdities. People now depended on objects outside their bodies for normal function. Objects that could break, scratch, slip, fog, be stolen, be misplaced, be sat upon accidentally. Though perhaps medieval people did this more cautiously given the cost. And there was likely social awkwardness too. Glasses visibly announced weakness while simultaneously improving capability. They marked aging, yet extended usefulness. They looked scholarly to some, ridiculous to others. One can easily imagine early mockery. Humans do not encounter strange, new, appearance-altering technology and respond with universal dignity. Absolutely not. Somewhere in medieval Italy, almost certainly, somebody looked at early spectacles and thought, "You look absurd," and yet they spread. Because practicality eventually overpowers ridicule when the benefit becomes obvious enough, especially among readers. The written word was becoming too important for aging eyes to fail without resistance. And so, quietly, almost humbly, eyewear entered human history. Not through kings first, not through dramatic battles, but through tired eyes leaning toward fading text. There is something fitting about that. One of humanity's most transformative technologies began not with conquest, but with exhaustion. The first people to wear glasses probably did not realize they were participating in a transformation of human aging. They were likely thinking something far simpler. Ah, there you are. There are the words again. Human revolutions often begin in deeply unglamorous moments. A person adjusting an awkward frame. A craftsman polishing cloudy glass. A monk discovering he no longer needs to hold parchment at arm's length like a man trying to read instructions from the moon. A merchant suddenly able to distinguish tiny ink marks in poor winter light. Civilization changes quietly first. Only later does history make speeches about it. The earliest spectacles were not universal tools. They were specialized relief for particular kinds of failing eyes, especially the aging eyes that struggled with close work. And this meant the first emotional relationship humans formed with eyewear was closely tied to getting older. That matters. Because before glasses, aging often arrived through detail. You did not wake one morning ancient. You noticed tiny betrayals, a missed stitch, a blurred letter, a hesitation reading scripture aloud, a coin mark that would not sharpen no matter how you tilted it toward the light. The body announced age in fragments, and fragments are harder to accept than catastrophes. A catastrophe, at least, has the dignity of clarity, but gradual decline is slippery. It invites denial, negotiation, excuses, hope, superstition, anger, pride, repetition, tiny humiliations accumulating one after another, like dust settling across furniture. Glasses interrupted that process. Not completely, of course. They did not restore youth. The hands still stiffened. The back still hurt. The winters still felt longer every year, in ways nobody fully understood, but everyone quietly recognized. Yet suddenly, the page returned, and when the page returns, identity returns with it. We underestimate how much of the self is tied to competence. An aging scribe without vision assistance was not merely inconvenienced. He risked becoming unnecessary. That is a terrifying thing for any human being in any century. To feel usefulness narrowing. To sense younger people watching patiently while your skills slow. Young eyes can be cruel without intending to be. Not openly cruel necessarily. Worse, sometimes. Effortlessly capable. An apprentice threads the needle instantly, while the older craftsperson struggles. A younger monk reads the faded line without hesitation. A child notices the approaching figure long before the elder recognizes them. The room quietly rearranges itself around stronger eyesight. And before glasses, that rearrangement often became permanent. Older people shifted away from detailed labor toward memory, instruction, supervision, storytelling. This was practical, even wise in many cases. But practicality does not always protect dignity, especially for proud people. And human beings have remained remarkably proud throughout history, despite endless evidence suggesting humility might be safer. So imagine the emotional complexity of early spectacles. On one hand, relief. On the other, admission. To wear glasses publicly was to acknowledge failing eyesight. The device announced weakness even as it corrected it. That contradiction must have sat heavily with many early users. Aging has always involved negotiation between concealment and adaptation. Do you hide the weakness? Do you adapt openly? Do you pretend? Do you joke first before others can? Do you withdraw quietly from tasks you can no longer perform comfortably? Glasses forced decisions, because unlike private squinting or subtle repositioning near windows, spectacles were visible. They sat directly on the face, like a declaration. And faces matter socially more than almost any other part of the body. Humans study faces obsessively. We read emotion, age, status, illness, mood, intelligence, trustworthiness, fatigue, danger, attraction, familiarity, all from faces. To place a strange object directly before the eyes altered social perception immediately. The wearer became different, perhaps scholarly, perhaps fragile, perhaps old, perhaps wise, perhaps ridiculous, perhaps wealthy enough to afford lenses, perhaps vain enough to use them. Probably all of these at different times. There is evidence in art from later medieval and Renaissance periods, showing spectacles associated particularly with scholars, scribes, and learned figures. Glasses gradually became linked with literacy itself, and literacy carried status. This created another fascinating contradiction. The same object that signaled bodily decline could also signal intelligence. weak eyes, strong mind. The face now carried both messages simultaneously. And because humans are complicated creatures, this likely produced vanity almost immediately. One suspects there were people who genuinely needed spectacles, and people who enjoyed looking as though they needed spectacles. Civilization invents performance extremely quickly. Still, even if some social performance emerged around eyewear, the practical impact remained enormous. Books could stay open longer in a person's life. That sentence sounds small until one lingers inside it. Books could stay open longer. Not just physically open, emotionally open, professionally open, spiritually open. A priest could continue reading sacred text aloud. A scholar could continue studying. A merchant could continue accounting accurately. An administrator could continue managing records. An artisan could continue inspecting detail. An older woman's sewing garments could continue mending with precision. Glasses did not merely sharpen vision, they delayed exclusion. That is the emotional center of this story. Before eyewear, many people slowly drifted out of close visual participation in society, sometimes gradually enough that nobody named it directly. They simply stopped doing certain tasks. Others took over. The body negotiated surrender quietly. Spectacles delayed surrender, and delay matters deeply to human beings. Even now, modern medicine often functions emotionally through delay of pain, delay of decline, delay of limitation, delay of endings. Humans are creatures who bargain passionately for additional time. The first spectacles were time bargains made of glass. Of course, they were also inconvenient little monsters. Early lenses were imperfect. Glass quality varied. Distortion existed. Frames could pinch. Without modern sidearms, many early designs balanced awkwardly on the nose or were held in position manually. Some probably slipped during work constantly. Others likely left marks on skin. Candlelight could glare against lenses. Scratches would interfere with clarity. Different lighting conditions changed usefulness. And then there was the terrifying possibility of breaking them. Imagine relying suddenly on spectacles after years of visual decline. Imagine the emotional attachment forming almost immediately. Then, imagine dropping them onto a stone floor. The sound alone would probably stop the heart briefly. Humans become emotionally dependent on assistive technology with astonishing speed because the contrast between assisted and unassisted life feels enormous. The first moment a person removes useful spectacles after experiencing restored clarity must have been strangely painful. The blur returns all at once. The world softens again. The page withdraws. The relief disappears. It becomes difficult to accept former limitations once improvement exists. And this creates a subtle psychological trap. The tool that restores independence also creates dependence. Without glasses, a person adapts to blur gradually over years. With glasses, clarity becomes normal again. Without them once more, the blur feels newly unbearable. Technology often works this way. We do not merely gain tools, we reorganize ourselves around them. Very quickly, spectacles became more than occasional curiosities. They became extensions of daily routine. A person wakes and reaches for them. A person prepares to read and adjusts them. A person worries about losing them while traveling. A person protects them carefully from damage. The face itself becomes part of the tool system. That transformation is surprisingly intimate. Before eyewear, most tools remained external. held briefly in the hand, set down afterward. Eyeglasses changed the relationship between body and technology. The corrective device rested directly at the threshold between self and world. It altered incoming reality before the brain processed it. That is philosophically strange when you think about it long enough. Two small pieces of shaped glass change how reality arrives inside the mind. And because glasses changed perception itself, they acquired symbolic power too. Over time, spectacles became linked with learning, seriousness, authority, administration, scholarship. Paintings began showing readers, clerics, doctors, and intellectuals wearing them. Sometimes, the glasses almost functioned visually, like shorthand for thoughtfulness, which is slightly amusing considering how often people wearing glasses are actually just trying to locate breadcrumbs or avoid walking into furniture. Still, symbols matter, and as eyewear spread, another shift quietly occurred. Aging intellectual labor became more sustainable. This is one of those changes history rarely dramatizes properly because it happens slowly across generations. But imagine societies increasingly dependent on reading and record keeping, suddenly able to preserve older, experienced readers longer. Knowledge retention changes. Aging scholars remain active. Experienced administrators continue working. Religious instruction stabilizes. Trade records improve. Legal systems maintain continuity. The effects ripple outward invisibly. All because old eyes regained access to close detail. There is something deeply moving about that when one pauses long enough to consider it. Civilization extended its memory partly through helping aging people continue reading, not through war, not through conquest, through lenses. And yet, even while spectacles spread among literate and skilled populations, countless ordinary people still lived in visual difficulty. Because glasses were not initially cheap universal objects, access mattered. A wealthy merchant had better chances than a poor labourer. Urban centres had better access than remote villages. Educated institutions encountered lenses sooner than isolated households. Vision assistance, like many useful things in history, spread unevenly, which meant many people still relied on older strategies. Memory, light, children, touch, routine, guesswork, proximity. A farmer with weak eyesight might continue depending heavily on familiar land patterns and sound. A grandmother might still position herself beside the brightest window every morning for sewing. A labourer unable to afford spectacles simply endured longer. The blurry world did not disappear instantly because lenses existed. Technology rarely replaces older survival systems cleanly. The old and new overlap for generations, and even those with spectacles still faced problems lenses could not solve. Cataracts remained devastating. This part of the story carries a different emotional texture. Less blur, more fog. People with cataracts often described worlds growing cloudy, dim, yellowed, softened. Light scattered strangely. Firelight bloomed into halos. Faces dissolved behind haze. Daylight could become painful, while detail still vanished. Some retained awareness of movement and brightness, long after precise sight faded. And unlike ordinary refractive errors, early spectacles could not simply restore clarity here. The eye itself had clouded internally. Ancient and medieval medicine did attempt interventions, especially procedures like couching, where the cloudy lens was displaced away from the visual axis using sharp instruments. The procedure had ancient roots and persisted for centuries in various forms. One should linger carefully with this image because it reveals the desperation surrounding vision loss. Imagine submitting willingly to someone placing a needle-like instrument into your eye. No modern anesthesia, no sterile operating room, no guarantee, no certainty of success. Only hope balanced against blindness. Humans will endure astonishing fear for the possibility of recovered sight. And sometimes the procedure worked partially. Enough light returned, enough shape returned, enough function returned to make survival possible again. Sometimes infection followed, sometimes pain, sometimes permanent blindness, but people still attempted it because losing sight meant losing more than scenery. It meant losing independence, recognition, work, safety, identity. The eye has always been tied to dignity, more tightly than we admit, which is perhaps why blindness and blurred sight appear so often in mythology, religion, literature, and metaphor. Vision feels connected to understanding itself. To lose clear sight can feel symbolically like losing certainty about the world. And before reliable eyewear, certainty itself was fragile. Aging made reality softer around the edges. Darkness erased detail. Smoke interfered. Weather changed visibility. Candles flickered. Roads disappeared into dusk. Faces emerged late from blur. People lived inside a visually unstable world far more often than we do now. Modern humans become irritated when a video buffers for 3 seconds. Medieval humans negotiated daily with incomplete reality. That changes the emotional texture of existence. It slows perception. It increases caution. It strengthens memory. It encourages routine. It magnifies fear at night. It makes familiarity emotionally precious. And perhaps this is why the arrival of spectacles mattered so profoundly. Even when technically primitive, they did not merely sharpen text, they stabilized reality slightly. The world stopped slipping away quite so quickly. And for aging humans, that must have felt almost miraculous. There is a particular loneliness to not recognizing something until it is already close. People with strong eyesight rarely think about how comforting distance can be. A figure appears far down the road, and almost unconsciously, the brain begins sorting possibilities. Friend, stranger, neighbor, traveler, soldier, harmless, dangerous, familiar, unknown. The decision happens quickly because the details arrive quickly. But for someone with poor distance vision, the world withholds information longer, and that delay changes emotional life. Before glasses for myopia became common, a nearsighted person often inhabited a reality that sharpened too late. Faces emerged suddenly from blur. Movement resolved only at closer range. Threats remained uncertain longer. Social recognition happened later than everyone expected. This could create strange misunderstandings. Imagine standing in a village lane while someone waves cheerfully from the far side of the square. You hesitate because you genuinely cannot identify them yet. The hesitation itself becomes social information. Why did he pause? Why did she ignore me? Was that deliberate? Was that disrespect? Poor vision easily disguises itself as bad manners. And before widespread understanding of visual conditions, people interpreted behavior morally before medically. A person who failed to recognize someone important could appear arrogant. A hesitant traveler could appear suspicious. A cautious guard could appear cowardly. A child squinting constantly might seem dreamy or inattentive. Human beings love explanations, even inaccurate ones, especially inaccurate ones delivered confidently. So many people with poor eyesight probably moved through life slightly misunderstood. Not dramatically, just enough to create friction. Tiny daily abrasions between what they intended and what others perceived. And this became much more dangerous outside familiar spaces. Inside a known home, weak eyesight could be negotiated through memory. The body learned rooms, hands learned walls, feet learned thresholds and uneven boards. One moved through familiarity almost automatically. But roads were different. Roads changed. Weather changed. Light changed. People changed. And travel before modern lighting already carried uncertainty, even for healthy eyes. Imagine walking a muddy road at dusk, somewhere in medieval Europe, or ancient Persia, or rural China, or almost anywhere before electric light conquered the night. The sky is darkening unevenly. The horizon still carries pale colour, but the ground has already begun disappearing. Trees become silhouettes. Distance flattens strangely. Shadows collect in ditches and beneath carts. The air smells damp and cold. Somewhere ahead a figure moves. Or perhaps it is not a figure. That uncertainty matters. A person with weak distance vision could spend long stretches of travel suspended between interpretations. Is someone waiting ahead? Is that a horse or a bush? Is the road turning? Is that smoke from a home or fog gathering low across fields? The eyes strain constantly for confirmation, and straining is exhausting. This is important because exhaustion changes perception further. The more tired the eyes become, the more the world softens at the edges. The more the brain guesses, the more caution increases. By nightfall, a traveller with poor vision might feel psychologically battered, not from physical danger alone, but from hours of incomplete information. One begins understanding why familiar inns, familiar fires, familiar voices mattered so much emotionally in pre-modern life. Recognition itself becomes comforting. A known face, a known doorway, a known sound of laughter, a known table beside predictable light. These things stabilize reality. Weak eyesight also reshaped relationships with wilderness. For hunters, shepherds, scouts, fishermen, and soldiers, visual detail at distance often meant survival. A movement in tall grass, a change in water texture, the silhouette of approaching riders, a predator at the edge of a flock, a shift in weather visible across hills. To miss these signs could be costly, and yet humans adapt remarkably. A nearsighted shepherd, for example, might rely less on visual counting and more on sound. Bells around animals became more than decoration. Dogs became extensions of awareness. Familiar grazing patterns mattered. The body learned landscapes deeply enough that unusual silence itself became information. Humans compensate so thoroughly that weakness sometimes disappears into routine. That does not mean the weakness stops hurting. It simply becomes woven into daily life tightly enough that nobody comments on it anymore. There is another emotional dimension here too. Shame. Not dramatic shame. Quiet shame. The embarrassment of asking again. The embarrassment of moving closer. The embarrassment of misidentifying someone. The embarrassment of pretending to see clearly when you do not. People have likely been pretending to recognize distant figures for thousands of years, nodding confidently toward a blur, and praying the blur turns out to be the correct person. Some ancient ancestor absolutely greeted a tree by mistake once. It feels statistically inevitable. And because human dignity is fragile, people developed strategies for concealment. A person with poor distance vision might become socially cautious, waiting for others to speak first. They might rely heavily on contextual clues. They might avoid situations exposing weakness publicly. They might laugh mistakes away before others notice discomfort. Humor is one of humanity's oldest camouflage systems, especially aging humor. My eyes are old. The light is terrible. This ink is awful. Who placed this here? The joke arrives before vulnerability fully exposes itself. And vulnerability surrounding eyesight cuts deeply because vision is tied to competence so strongly. Consider warfare for a moment. History often imagines war through banners, armor, cavalry charges, dramatic speeches, glorious paintings full of identifiable faces, and beautifully arranged chaos. Real battlefields were smoke, confusion, mud, screaming, dust, poor visibility, weather, exhaustion, and incomplete information. For a person with weak eyesight, the battlefield must have been horrifying. Friend and enemy blurred together at distance. Signals difficult to interpret. Movement emerging too late. Night watches filled with uncertainty. Shadows becoming threats repeatedly. Even outside battle itself, military life depended heavily on visual reliability. Guards, scouts, archers, navigators, lookouts, all required strong distance perception. A nearsighted guard was not quirky. He was dangerous to the people depending on him, and yet many likely served anyway. Because pre-modern societies rarely sorted humans neatly according to medical optimization, people adapted as best they could within available structures. A weak-eyed person might avoid certain duties, compensate heavily, or simply endure constant anxiety. Anxiety deserves attention here, because poor vision quietly encourages vigilance. If information arrives late, one learns to anticipate danger early. A person with weak eyesight may listen harder, react faster to sounds, stay nearer familiar companions, avoid unnecessary night movement, memorize routes obsessively, or distrust uncertain environments more than others do. Over years, this shapes personality. What modern observers might label timidness or caution may actually be intelligent adaptation to unreliable visual input. And the night magnified all of it. Night before modern cities was enormous. We forget this because modern darkness is damaged darkness, polluted darkness, diluted darkness. Even rural places now often carry distant electrical glow. Ancient night was heavier, more complete, more territorial, and for people with weak eyesight, it arrived early. This detail keeps returning because it matters emotionally. One person in a household might continue functioning comfortably, while another's useful world collapses into uncertainty much sooner each evening. Imagine sitting beside a fire while others continue small tasks around the room. One person still threads needles. Another still sorts grain. Another still reads aloud softly. But your own eyes have already surrendered detail. Faces blur around the edges. Objects disappear beyond the immediate flame. You begin relying more on voices than shapes. Slowly, almost invisibly, your relationship with reality shifts from visual certainty toward interpretive trust. You trust familiar sounds. You trust memory. You trust routine. You trust that the knife remains where it usually remains. You trust that no stool has been moved unexpectedly. You trust the person entering the room is who the voice suggests they are. Trust becomes infrastructural, which perhaps explains why sudden disruptions felt so emotionally powerful in pre-modern life. A moved object, an unfamiliar visitor, a strange noise outside after dark, all carried extra weight when vision itself could not immediately verify safety. Ghost stories, supernatural folklore, wandering spirits, strange presences in forests and roads, all of these become easier to understand when one remembers how visually unstable ordinary life often was. A person standing partly visible at the edge of torchlight genuinely looked uncanny. A face half seen through smoke genuinely felt unsettling. An approaching figure emerging slowly from fog genuinely triggered uncertainty. The imagination did not require much encouragement, and imagination thrives where detail fails. Meanwhile, even in daylight, the environment constantly challenged the eyes. Snow glare could become painful and blinding. Sea reflections exhausted sailors. Desert brightness overwhelmed vision. Smoke from hearths and workshops irritated eyes continuously. Infections spread easily. Dust entered everything. Fine labor strained focus endlessly. The human eye was under assault from environment as much as age, which makes the eventual normalization of eyewear feel almost inevitable in hindsight. Not because humans suddenly became clever enough to invent glasses. Humans had long been clever. The problem was producing lenses consistently, affordably, accurately, and usefully enough to integrate into ordinary life. And once that process began, the social meaning of glasses evolved slowly. At first, spectacles remained somewhat unusual, linked to literacy, scholarship, administration, religion. But over generations, they became less symbolic and more practical. This transition is fascinating because all technologies eventually lose their magic. The first spectacles likely inspired wonder. Later, spectacles inspired convenience. Eventually, spectacles inspired annoyance when misplaced. That is the full life cycle of human innovation. A miracle survives for perhaps 2 generations before becoming something people sit on accidentally. And as eyewear became more common, another subtle shift occurred. Society began expecting older people to remain visually productive longer. This is important. Before corrective lenses, there were natural limits on sustained close work with aging eyes. After spectacles, those limits changed. More reading became possible, more writing, more bookkeeping, more scholarship, more administration. Civilization quietly increased demands because assistance existed. Humans always do this. Every technology that reduces suffering eventually creates new expectations. Glasses extended functional years, which meant more could be required from aging workers, scholars, clerics, artisans. Relief and obligation arrived together. Still, most people likely accepted that bargain gladly, because the alternative was watching detail dissolve permanently. And detail matters emotionally in ways difficult to describe fully. The texture of cloth, the grain of wood, the tiny crack in pottery, the lines of handwriting from a loved one, the wrinkles beside familiar eyes, the steam rising from food, the thread entering a needle correctly at last. These are small things. But human life is almost entirely constructed from small things repeated. Perhaps that is why restoring visual detail feels so deeply reassuring. It returns texture to existence itself. And yet, even as spectacles spread gradually through parts of the world, countless people still aged inside blur. Countless others still faced cataracts no lens could fix. Countless laborers still worked under impossible lighting conditions. Countless women still sewed beside smoky fires. Countless travelers still feared roads after dusk. History changes unevenly. One city experiments with improved lenses, while another village still relies entirely on memory and daylight. One wealthy merchant orders spectacles, while a poor farmer simply squints harder. One scholar extends his reading life 20 years, while another quietly withdraws from texts forever. The blurry world did not disappear. It retreated slowly. And even now, if one thinks carefully enough, traces of it remain inside modern habits. The instinct to move toward light before reading, the irritation when glasses vanish, the panic of waking unable to find them, the emotional relief when clarity returns, the subtle fear of losing visual independence with age. These feelings are ancient, much older than modern optometry offices and designer frames and anti-reflective coatings and little cloths. Humans immediately lose within 3 days of purchase. Somewhere beneath all modern eyewear remains the original emotional truth. Humans are frightened when the world becomes unclear and deeply grateful when it sharpens again. As spectacles spread through Europe and later through other parts of the world, something subtle began happening to civilization itself. Not dramatic enough for kings to notice immediately, not loud enough for church bells, not visible enough for statues, but steady. Older eyes remained useful longer. And when older eyes remain useful longer, societies begin storing more knowledge outside the human body. This matters enormously. For most of human history, experience was fragile because experienced people were fragile. Knowledge lived inside aging individuals who could forget, weaken, die, or simply lose the ability to work effectively. Oral traditions survived through repetition and memory. Written traditions survived through copying. Both depended heavily on human endurance. Then spectacles quietly altered the equation. A scholar could continue reading decades longer. A clerk could continue recording information accurately. A merchant could continue managing accounts. A map maker could continue drawing fine lines. A physician could continue studying texts and examining details. A printer could continue correcting proofs. The useful lifespan of precision extended, and precision accumulates over generations. This is one of the hidden engines beneath the growth of complex societies. Tiny improvements in maintaining accurate information compound over time. A civilization where aging readers remain active longer behaves differently from one where visual decline removes people from detailed intellectual labor earlier. The Renaissance, for example, is often imagined through grand paintings, marble statues, rediscovered classical texts, dramatic architecture, brilliant thinkers staring intensely into middle distance. Very cinematic. Very serious. But underneath all of that sat tired people reading enormous amounts of text. Human civilization is always less glamorous at ground level. The Renaissance depended heavily on reading, copying, studying, comparing, annotating, calculating, observing, correcting, preserving. Thousands of tiny acts of visual concentration. And spectacles helped make that sustained concentration physically possible for aging scholars and artisans. One begins realizing how strange history actually is. Entire cultural movements may partially depend on whether old people can still see small letters. And as literacy expanded, the emotional relationship between humans and eyewear deepened further. Because, once reading spreads beyond narrow scholarly or religious circles, visual strain spreads too. Merchants need records. Lawyers need documents. Officials need archives. Printers need proofreaders. Teachers need books. Students need notes. Craftsmen need patterns. Navigators need charts. The written world expands outward like roots through soil, and the eye becomes increasingly burdened. There is almost something tragicomic about this. Humans invented systems requiring immense visual labor, and then discovered the body was not fully prepared for the consequences. Eyes that evolved for landscapes, movement, weather, distance, firelight, and survival suddenly spent hours fixed on tiny black symbols. The eye adapted reluctantly. Still adapting, honestly. Even now, modern humans stare into glowing rectangles until their vision blurs, and then react with complete surprise, as though the body has betrayed them personally. Meanwhile, in earlier centuries, people confronted visual fatigue under conditions far harsher than ours. Consider the rise of printing after Gutenberg. Books multiplied, pages standardized, texts circulated faster, reading expanded, and suddenly, poor eyesight became harder to ignore because there was simply more to see. The printing press did not merely spread knowledge, it increased demand for functional vision. A society full of books creates pressure on eyes. That pressure changed industries. Lens grinding improved gradually. Frame designs evolved. Different lens strengths became recognized. Craftsmen specialized. Urban workshops expanded production. Eyewear slowly drifted from rarity toward practicality. Not instantly, never instantly. Technological normalization moves unevenly. First, the wealthy, then professionals, then broader urban populations. Rural areas, often much later. Some people embraced spectacles eagerly, others resisted them emotionally or socially. There is always resistance when bodies become visibly assisted. Even now, many people delay wearing glasses because glasses symbolize something uncomfortable to them. Aging, weakness, dependence, difference. Human beings often resist the very tool that would relieve their suffering, because the tool makes the suffering visible. That emotional contradiction is ancient, and spectacles altered appearance in unmistakable ways. Faces changed. A person reading through lenses looked different psychologically to observers. More concentrated, perhaps. More intellectual. More severe. More elderly. More mysterious. The eyes themselves appeared transformed behind curved glass. Reflections obscured direct gaze. Light caught the lenses strangely. Expressions shifted. Artists noticed this quickly. By the Renaissance, and afterward, glasses began appearing more regularly in paintings and visual culture. Scholars wore them. Saints occasionally wore them. Physicians, clerks, intellectuals, readers, spectacles increasingly signaled a relationship with knowledge. And this produced one of history's quieter ironies. The object originally associated with visual weakness gradually became associated with intelligence. To wear glasses could imply literacy, study, authority, education, administrative power. The weak eye became socially prestigious under certain conditions. Humans are endlessly complicated creatures. a tool designed partly to compensate for decline, slowly transformed into a symbol of mental capability. Of course, this symbolism created its own absurdities. Some people undoubtedly adopted spectacles, partly for status. Some exaggerated their dependence. Some chose elaborate frames. Some treated lenses carefully, like treasured, scholarly instruments. Others probably complained constantly about them while refusing to stop wearing them for even a single day. Again, humanity changes very little emotionally across centuries. One can easily imagine a 17th century scholar muttering irritably for 10 minutes because he cannot locate his spectacles while the spectacles are resting directly atop his head. Although admittedly certain frame styles may have made this more difficult, still, the broader transformation continued. As eyewear improved, aging changed shape socially. Not completely, not equally, but perceptibly. The old intellectual no longer needed to retreat from reading quite so early. The aging artisan could continue detail work longer. The experienced accountant remained useful. The older tailor kept sewing. The grandmother kept mending. The elderly priest kept reading scripture aloud. Visual decline no longer forced immediate withdrawal from all close labor. That extension matters emotionally because usefulness matters emotionally. Humans tolerate physical discomfort surprisingly well when they still feel necessary, and spectacles helped preserve necessity. Yet the blurry world never vanished entirely. Even people with glasses remained vulnerable to poor lighting, cataracts, illness, eye injuries, infections, smoke, glare, and aging. Lens quality remained imperfect for centuries. Many people still lacked access. Some conditions remained untreatable. And perhaps most importantly, human beings themselves continued aging psychologically around their changing vision. There is a melancholy rhythm to aging eyesight. No technology fully erases. The moment when reading becomes tiring faster than before, the instinctive search for brighter light, the frustration with small print, the sudden realization that one arm is no longer long enough. This experience repeated generation after generation. Only now, the decline had a negotiator. Glasses entered the conversation between body and time. And once that conversation began, humans became increasingly unwilling to surrender visual clarity again. This led eventually to stronger lenses, more precise prescriptions, different styles for different needs, monocles, lorgnettes, pince-nez, bifocals. Benjamin Franklin famously helped popularize bifocals because he grew tired of switching between different glasses for distance and near work. There is something wonderfully human about this. Even great thinkers become irritated by inconvenience eventually. In fact, much technological progress emerges not from noble inspiration, but from accumulated annoyance. A person struggles with a problem repeatedly. Eventually, they say, enough. A solution appears. The solution creates new annoyances. Humanity continues indefinitely. Meanwhile, industrialization accelerated everything. Factories increased production. Urban populations grew. Education expanded. Printed materials multiplied massively. Precision labor intensified. Scientific work demanded detailed observation. Offices filled with paperwork. The modern eye was being born. An eye expected to process enormous amounts of close information daily. And this had consequences. By the 19th and 20th centuries, spectacles became increasingly ordinary objects rather than specialized scholarly tools. Children wore them. Workers wore them. Shopkeepers teachers, railway clerks, factory inspectors, typists, accountants, students. The face carrying lenses no longer automatically signaled elite learning. It signaled participation in modern visual life. This normalization changed social psychology again. When many people wear glasses, weakness becomes common rather than exceptional. Shared dependence reduces stigma somewhat. The object transitions from strange aid to ordinary accessory. Still, emotional tensions remained. Children teased each other. Adults delayed eye examinations. People worried about appearing old. Others embraced spectacles as part of identity. Fashion entered fully into the story eventually, because humans cannot resist turning survival tools into self-expression. Clothing becomes status. Armor becomes decoration. Weapons become ceremonial. And eyewear becomes fashion. This progression feels almost inevitable now. Yet underneath the fashionable frames and polished modern lenses remains the ancient emotional core, fear of losing clarity. That fear still shapes behavior constantly. The panic when glasses break, the dread of worsening prescriptions, the anxiety surrounding eye disease, the relief after finding lost frames beside the bed, the instinctive reaching for glasses immediately after waking. Modern humans perform rituals ancient people would understand emotionally, even if the technology itself astonished them, because the emotional relationship with sight has remained remarkably stable. We fear uncertainty. We fear dependence. We fear losing access to detail. We fear the world dissolving gradually around us. And perhaps no one fears this more sharply than people who once saw clearly. That is another hidden emotional truth inside eyewear history. Someone born with limited sight adapts differently from someone who loses clarity later. The second person remembers detail vividly. They compare constantly between before and after. They mourn specific losses. The leaf edges once visible, the stars once sharper, the tiny handwriting once effortless, the distant face once recognizable instantly. Glasses softened that morning. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough for people to continue participating in worlds that increasingly demanded visual precision. And then eventually, civilization crossed another threshold entirely. Artificial light improved radically. This changed visual life almost as profoundly as spectacles themselves. Gas lamps, electric bulbs, street lighting, bright interiors, extended work hours, night reading. Suddenly, humans no longer organized life entirely around daylight. This sounds liberating because it was liberating. It was also exhausting. Once artificial light became reliable, societies expected longer visual productivity. Reading after dark became ordinary. Offices extended hours. Factories operated late. Students studied into the night. Human eyes gained opportunity and lost rest simultaneously. Again, every solution creates new demands. And so the modern visual condition emerged gradually. A civilization built around sustained, close focus under artificial lighting with widespread optical correction. A civilization where millions wake each morning and immediately reach for external lenses before greeting the day. Which raises a strange question. Could modern civilization exist without eyewear? Not merely comfortably exist at all in recognizable form. How many scientists, navigators, printers, teachers, engineers, clerks, writers, doctors, mathematicians, architects, watchmakers, map makers, administrators, researchers, and students throughout history depended on corrective lenses to continue functioning effectively. How many discoveries remained possible because aging eyes stayed useful longer? How many books were copied, corrected, printed, read, preserved? How many lives quietly changed because someone could once again distinguish one tiny mark from another? The answer is impossible to calculate fully, which feels fitting because eyewear itself entered history quietly, not with conquest, not with empires collapsing, not with armies marching. It entered through fatigue, through blurred letters, through tired eyes beside weak candles, through old readers refusing to surrender the page. And perhaps that is why glasses still feel strangely personal, even now. They sit at the border between body and world, correcting a private weakness that almost everyone eventually understands. A tiny, transparent negotiation with time. And perhaps that is the strangest part of this entire story. Not that humans invented glasses, but that for so long, they lived without them. Modern people remove their glasses for a moment and immediately begin searching for them again. A familiar panic rises almost automatically. The room softens, edges loosen, text withdraws. The world becomes slightly less trustworthy. Even those with relatively mild prescriptions often feel unsettled without correction because clarity has become emotionally normal. But for most humans who have ever lived, uncertainty was normal. Not perfect blindness, not dramatic darkness, just a constant negotiation with incomplete detail. And once you begin seeing history through that lens, everything changes slightly. You notice how often human beings arranged themselves near windows, how many tasks depended on daylight, how carefully objects were kept in familiar places, how strongly older generations relied on memory and routine, how deeply people valued familiarity itself. Familiarity is easier to navigate than clarity. A known room requires less vision. A known face reveals itself faster. A known road demands less interpretation. A known voice reduces fear. Perhaps this is one reason humans become emotionally attached to home. Not merely because it shelters the body, but because it reduces uncertainty. The eye relaxes among familiar objects. Even now, people walk confidently through dark, familiar rooms, while stumbling awkwardly in brightly lit, unfamiliar ones. The body remembers. Ancient people lived much closer to that dependence on memory. A person waking before dawn in a medieval household probably moved partly through touch before sight fully joined the day. The floorboards known by pressure, the table edge known by fingertips, the hearth located by faint warmth and old ash smell. Vision emerged gradually alongside morning itself, and mornings mattered immensely. Morning light was not merely beautiful, it was practical mercy. There is something deeply human about the relief carried by first daylight in a visually difficult world. Shapes return, corners separate, faces emerge. The uncertain becomes legible again. The world explains itself each morning through light. Before reliable eyewear and modern illumination, this daily restoration carried enormous emotional weight. One can imagine elderly readers drifting toward windows almost instinctively after sunrise. Not because they loved scenery, though perhaps they did, but because daylight meant temporary partnership between the world and the eye. A few good hours, a few clear tasks, a little recovered certainty. And certainty is comforting. Humans pretend otherwise sometimes. We praise mystery and ambiguity and complexity, usually while sitting in brightly lit rooms with functioning vision and labelled exits. But most people, throughout most of history, preferred knowing what stood in front of them. Poor eyesight interrupted that comfort constantly. The interruption might be tiny, a blurred expression, a missed gesture, a wrong step, a misread word, a face recognized too late. Tiny things, yet human life is built almost entirely from tiny things repeated until they become emotional climate. A person who strains to see every evening experiences a different emotional climate from someone who does not. More caution, perhaps, more fatigue, more dependence on predictability, more anxiety in unfamiliar places. And as people aged, this climate intensified. There is a sadness to aging eyesight that feels almost philosophical because it changes one's relationship with reality itself. The world does not disappear completely. It withdraws selectively. Detail leaves first, sharpness leaves, fine distinction leaves, then perhaps confidence leaves. That sequence matters emotionally, because confidence in perception is one of the quiet foundations beneath daily life. To trust your eyes is to trust your orientation inside the world. When that trust weakens, the body compensates endlessly. Lean closer, squint harder, move toward light. Ask for confirmation. Double check. Pause before speaking. Wait for the voice before identifying the face, and slowly the rhythm of life changes. This is why spectacles mattered beyond utility. They restored confidence. Not absolute confidence. Human vision remains fragile even now, but enough confidence to continue participating comfortably in reading, working, traveling, recognizing, creating. Enough confidence to keep moving through society without constant negotiation. Perhaps that is why the emotional attachment to glasses can become surprisingly intense. They are not merely tools. They become part of orientation itself. Lose them, and suddenly the world feels less stable. A modern person searching desperately for lost glasses at midnight is participating in an ancient fear. The fear that reality may become inaccessible again. And yet there is another side to this story too. Blur, itself shaped humanity. A perfectly clear world is not necessarily the world humans evolved inside emotionally. Much of history occurred at the edge of visibility, through smoke, through fog, through weak firelight, through aging eyes, through distance, through uncertainty. People listened more carefully because sight failed often. People memorized because reading remained difficult. People valued routine because visual improvisation carried risk. People stayed close to community because strangers in darkness were dangerous. People told stories about unseen things because unseen things genuinely surrounded them. The blurry world influenced imagination, perhaps even spirituality. There is something almost mystical about half-seen reality. Shadows suggest possibilities sharp detail destroys. A distant figure unresolved by the eye invites projection. Candlelight softens certainty. Fog enlarges imagination. One wonders whether modern brightness has reduced certain kinds of human dreaming simply because we now verify too much too quickly. Ancient nights left room for uncertainty. Uncertainty leaves room for myth. And myths often thrive exactly where vision weakens. A movement in forest darkness. A face glimpsed briefly. A figure beside the road. Something watching from beyond firelight. To modern eyes flooded constantly with illumination, these experiences seem less persuasive. But in worlds shaped by fragile visibility, uncertainty itself carried authority. The body believed what the eye could not disprove. Even now, fear intensifies in darkness despite all rational understanding. A coat hanging in low light becomes a person for one startled second. The mind rushes ahead of verification. Humans remain ancient at night, and perhaps always will. Meanwhile, the eye itself continued accompanying humanity through every transformation. Through agriculture, cities, monasteries, printing presses, laboratories, factories, offices, schools, screens, always adapting, always straining, always negotiating with new environments. Today we live surrounded by unprecedented visual demands. Tiny text, artificial light, endless reading, digital screens held inches from the face. Millions of people spending entire days focusing intensely on symbolic information. The modern eye works extraordinarily hard. And still, every morning, countless people reach immediately for assistance before engaging with the world. A small ritual, so ordinary now, barely noticed. Yet hidden inside that ritual is the memory of centuries. The old monk near the window, the seamstress beside the hearth, the merchant tilting coins toward light, the traveller squinting into dusk, the grandmother missing the needle repeatedly, the scholar discovering the page had become readable again, the cataract patient risking pain for another glimpse of shape and brightness. All of them remain somehow present in the act of putting on glasses. Because eyewear did not merely correct vision, it changed the emotional experience of aging. Before spectacles, the future often carried a visual, narrowing, difficult to resist. The near world faded, reading receded, detail withdrew, the useful years shortened. Glasses interrupted that narrowing. They gave extension, delay, negotiation. Not immortality, not youth restored, just more time, inside clarity. And humans have always loved more time, especially when the extra time allows them to continue seeing the people they love, the work they understand, the words that shaped them, the small details that make the world feel inhabited instead of distant. Perhaps that is why glasses became so intimate so quickly. They sit directly before the eyes, almost between the soul and reality, in the symbolic language humans instinctively use. We clean them carefully, protect them, depend on them, touch them absent-mindedly while thinking, remove them when tired, search for them anxiously when lost. Some people even feel emotionally incomplete without them, as though part of their orientation toward existence itself has gone missing. That would make sense to ancient people. Very little about the emotional reality of weak eyesight has changed. The technologies changed. The materials changed. The precision changed. The fashion changed. But the feeling remained, the fear of blur, the relief of focus, the exhaustion of strain, the comfort of clarity. And somewhere, beneath all modern optical science, remains the same ancient human desire that guided exhausted readers centuries ago beside weak candles and smoky windows, to hold the world still long enough to see it clearly. So tonight, before sleep takes you completely, perhaps notice the strange kindness hidden in ordinary lenses, a technology so familiar it almost disappears. Two small, transparent surfaces quietly negotiating between the imperfect human eye and the overwhelming complexity of reality. Not conquering age, not defeating weakness, just helping. Helping a little longer. Helping one more page, one more face, one more evening beside the light, one more glimpse of detail before darkness softens the edges again. And perhaps that is enough.